As right-wing politicians win elections across the Americas, Mexico stands out as the exception, governed by the left-wing Morena party since 2018. Why is the Mexican right struggling even as right-wing movements gain strength in the region? What do the old and new right look like in Mexico, and could they win back territory from the left in upcoming elections? Welcome to the MexPat interview. I'm Kathleen Bonet, and my guest today is Alex González Ormerod, founder of The Mexico Political Economist and author of La derecha no existe, pero ahí está, about the history and future of the right in Mexico. Thank you for joining me, Alex.
Thank you for having me.
So early in the book, you write that this book is a bad idea and that others told you so because the right is irrelevant in Mexican politics today. There's avoidance of even identifying as right wing. So how did the right end up hiding in the ideological closet, as you put it?
It was even worse than people saying that it wasn't a good idea from from society. It was the subjects of the book themselves who said it was a bad idea. But that to me was an interesting flashing red light, because what it shows you is actually there was something to hide, and that made it all the more interesting. Ultimately, why Mexican right wingers hide their identity is a sort of long historical exploration that I go into the book. But very basically, no one wants to recognize themselves as right wing today because it's just basically unpopular.
Mhm.
The left has taken control. I think they do get quite a lot of, or they feel they get a lot of harassment. And chiefly, there's a lot of different definitions of right wing means, both in the world and in Mexico. And so what they're having to do is define themselves. And if they put a label on themselves, I think they feel they're losing out.
So I think for outsiders who already know a little bit about Mexican politics, they will have heard of the National Action Party, the PAN, and consider that the representative of the right in Mexican politics, which governed the country from 2000 to 2012. And so, how did it go from that to governing the country to where it is today, which is very weak in comparison to the left?
It probably got that way because it governed the country. I think one of the interesting things that one finds in Mexican politics is that ideology doesn't matter to the extent that you're in the political system. It was a political system designed towards the end of the 20th century by the one-party state before democracy arrived, formally in the year 2000. But we had a bunch of electoral reforms in the lead up to that. And what basically those electoral reforms made parties become is the one party, the PRI. And so that forced any party of any sort, of any ideology, to become ever more like that party was, which means avoiding sort of ideological clarity, sort of opening its doors up to corruption and all that, not because people are inherently bad or the party was inherently corrupted ideologically or otherwise, but because the system forced them to be like that way. And the PAN was a clear example. They arrived in power in the year 2000, and as soon as that happened, they were flooded with people who would eventually become the caciques, the regional bosses of that party, in the most corrupt way and usually in the most anti-ideological way. And a lot of the old panistas really resent that. And so there's that little struggle going on between the caciques who took control of the regional apparatus of the party, and then the sort of ideologues who still cling on to what they hope will be a renaissance of the party, but they're finding it hard. The most clear example, I think, is the fact that the Mexican national leadership of the PAN is the Mexico City caciques, the regional bosses of Mexico City, who now control the entire party and who are accused of some pretty worrying corruption across Mexico City, the cartel inmobiliario. But they got to power, according to sources within the same PAN, they got to power through corruption and coercion. So, I mean, it's a very clear example of how this party that used to be sort of like for democracy and, center-right ideals is now very much behaving like the old one-party state, even though they have no power anymore.
Right, right. So, yes, I mean, you talk in the book a lot about how this old right, for lack of a better term, was also, it coincided with this happening in other parts of the world as well, of course, and the end of history kind of era, and about Enrique Krause's essay about democracy without adjectives, and how, which of course is liberal democracy, but liberal apparently is not an adjective, which reminded me also of during the 2024 election campaign when Xochitl Galvez said she would be colorblind as president in reference to political parties. And this notion that if you try to appeal to everyone, you end up appealing to no one. Do you think the PAN has learned anything from the losses in 2024?
They've been hopeless. They've paid lip service to learning because they lost so badly. And so clearly you've got to learn something. And people who are very happy to throw Xochitl Galvez under the bus, I think, have decided that they do want to be right-wing, but what does right-wing mean? That's a completely different kettle of fish. And so you get this wonderful situation in which the PAN relaunched itself. This is actually after the book was published, but it's more or less predicted in the book that something like this would happen, which is they relaunched themselves as a right-wing party, and their slogan was family, liberty, and fatherland. And I'm sure that if you sat down a committee of panistas in the same room, every single one would have a completely different definition of what each of those terms means. And that's a problem for the party because they refuse to have a sit-down chat about what they actually define themselves as. That ambiguity, those sort of big abstract concepts are useful to hold this coalition together, which again, right, is the coalition that held the party together for a long time when they were against the one party state. And then when they were in government, power is a good glue. But once they were out of power, they sort of fell apart because they don't know what they believe in. And so what the relaunch ended up being was actually just the launch of an app which allows you to become a PAN candidate if you can gather enough support, no matter who you are, which is the definition of anti-ideology.
So, and that hasn't gone very well so far, presumably.
No.
They haven't really.
We don't know how it'll go, but it'll definitely give them an excuse to open their doors to people who might be looking to take over the party, but we'll probably get into that later.
Mm-hmm. And their party membership is also quite low in comparison to other parties, to pretty much everybody. More recently, there has been this emergence of a new currents, more adjacent to Trump, to a populist right, and it's getting more and more attention in Mexico. So can you briefly go over how those movements have emerged and who is leading them?
They're kind of going through a similar process as the PAN is, but in a much faster way, which I think is probably more useful to them. They're parties that emerged saying that they weren't either left-wing or right-wing, but they were against bad government, which is a terrible thing to be because most people think the government's doing a good job. So you've got to board them in a different way. I think crucially, this is a really interesting data point to me, the party that made the most gains in the opposition in the previous election, actually, I think the party that made the most gains, period, even though it came from a very low bar, was the Movimiento Ciudadano party. And what's interesting about them is that they made a very clear choice to not go against the government on the basis that it was just bad and dictatorial because they realized that wasn't popular. So they decided to say, we could do better than the government, and the government is actually not doing what it's saying it should be doing, even though they're sort of halfway there. And they did very well. I think they were surprising, and they surprised a lot of people. Whereas I think the PAN is very much stuck in the government is bad and therefore you must want to vote for us because it's clearly bad, even though the polls definitely don't indicate that. Claudia Sheinbaum and López Obrador before her, very popular presidents. And so what you get with the other right-wing parties that are emerging, the other right-wing movements, is that they've gone through that process of, I think, the 7 stages of grief. They've gone through the denial bit, and now they're starting to emerge. And that was an interesting period during the writing of this book. At the beginning of the writing of the book, they were very clear that they weren't either left or right. And then they decided, well, we're not left or right, but we're definitely conservative. And now they're just saying the right way, which is like in terms of definitions and like the political philosophy and the political philosophy of it all is a fascinating trend because anti-ideological to conservative to right-wing is an interesting sort of development to go through. But anyway, these parties, now that they've recognized their right-wing, now have a problem, which is they're different sorts of right-wing. And they're in an even deeper trouble because I think politically and pragmatically within that ideology, they've adhered themselves to the Donald Trump brand of right-wingness, this sort of like nationalist populism, very America first. The problem is, it's convenient because it gives them sort of a place to retreat to. Like literally sometimes they go to the United States and they feel like they're loved there. But also, ideologically they say, oh, it's doing really well in America. So clearly like it can do well here. But the problem is, Mexico isn't the United States to say something incredibly stupid and obvious, but clearly not. And so they have massive issues with the sort of American right wingness that they're trying to import into Mexico, because a lot of it is very anti Mexican, sometimes like explicitly anti Mexican, but also sometimes it's anti Mexican in the sense that it's goes against the mores of what the traditional right in Mexico feels. So you've got, for example, the clearest example is the Partido or the Movimiento, not Partido yet, Viva Mexico under Eduardo Verástegui, who your American audience will probably recognize him as one of the producers for The Sound of Freedom, this very popular MAGA film. He was a producer, and what's fascinating about him is that he's very enmeshed into this MAGA world, but crucially, he's also a very Catholic figure. He leans into, like, his party is literally called Long Live Mexico. It's a very nationalist movement. But the problem is, when you have MAGA, which is a very American like sort of force, it doesn't mix well with the way he's doing it. So, for example, he's always going on about how Catholic institutions need to be respected and need to be put like at the forefront. But also, he hates American Catholics because they sort of become decidedly left wing. First with Pope Francis, now with the American Pope, Pope Leo, who I think there was an Atlantic piece recently about how Pope Leo is reactivating the American Catholic left. And so that leaves someone like Verástegui, who is actually very much part of this right-wing Mexican Catholic tradition. It makes it very difficult for him to meld those two sides of his identity.
Right. Yeah, he doesn't necessarily seem to have that skill set. But touching on Catholicism and all of this, because I think, a lot of people don't maybe realize how anti-Catholic the government has been in Mexico since the Cristero War in particular, and why it has had a very limited role in politics in the 20th century and 21st century. So can you talk a little bit more about the relationship between the Catholic right and the right-wing parties, and then also the evangelical side of that equation?
Just to go into the history a bit, because you're absolutely right. Weirdly, the previous left-wing president and now the current left-wing president of Jewish descent have been they haven't at all been anti-Catholic in any sense compared to previous administrations that were actively militantly atheist. We're talking about the 1920s and 30s. But Mexico does have that inheritance of anti-Catholicism and anti-religiosity, which in Mexico, being a very Catholic country, makes it by definition anti-Catholic. So rewinding to that very anti-Catholic era, we have governments that literally basically outlawed the outward practice of Catholicism. They banned nuns and priests from using their habits in public. They banned, I think they literally took away their right to vote. And so what we've seen over the past 100 years is a loosening of that policy, but very much still in that tradition until we get to the PAN getting to power in the year 2000. And, a bit before that, as the PAN looked like it was coming into power, the government started opening up. They welcomed an ambassador from the Vatican. They had Pope John Paul II visit, and that was a great triumph. And then slowly but surely, they loosened that up. But interestingly, and this was an interesting point of contention for the book, the more I researched the Catholic Church and its sort of like interference in Mexican politics, because you would think, right, if Mexico's so anti-Catholic, surely the Catholic Church is behind a lot of the sort of resistance, the reaction. And it turns out it isn't. Most of the time that we hear about the Catholic Church sort of being in the shadows, it's been one of two things: paranoia from the left, which has actually resulted in the left pushing back even further than, and the right being able to resist because there was actually no conspiracy. And so that's those moments when the right is in power and the left is very paranoid. You actually get massive pushback when Mexico gets abortion laws passed and equal and what's the term in English? I forgot it. Same-sex marriage approved. It's during these moments of like anti-Catholic fear from the left, or rather like Catholic panic. What the Catholic Church, it turns out, is never really powerful because it has been defanged over the course of the whole 20th century. So sure, they're happy to be involved. Some of them are very explicit about wanting to get involved, but they're completely unable to do it. And so you get this weird situation where you get three sorts of Catholic. You get the Catholic who wants to really take control of everything and they're completely useless. You've got the Catholic that is very, very corrupt. and sometimes degenerate. I'm thinking of Father Maciel here, who basically created this infrastructure of corruption and pedophilia around him, but not in a sense that like the Catholic Church was trying to impose it onto the state, but rather it was his own fiefdom. It was about personal corruption. And then the vast majority of the church, which is very regionalized, very splintered, and completely apolitical most of the time.
Hmm.
If you wanted, you could even add a little caveat to that last one, which is a left-wing church, which is still pretty powerful in Mexico, not in numbers, but in terms of its ideology. So you've got the Jesuits, who still runs one of the biggest universities in Mexico, the Ibero, ITESO in Guadalajara. And then you've also got pretty militant local priests in places like Chiapas, where they work with indigenous communities. And weirdly, what has really hurt them is the cartel violence. That has really destroyed those progressive Catholic networks. It hasn't been the government, it's been the absence of the government as the cartels have rolled in.
Right. Right. So, I mean, it's also, if you think about it as the country being broadly Catholic, and I mean, not just as a religious identification, but almost just as a cultural
Yeah.
identification, it doesn't leave much room to kind of fight to convert people in a sense. Whereas I think that with evangelicals, and because they're usually in the minority, there's a lot more zeal on the political side and making policy changes in their favor. So, but what's interesting about that is that that is not entirely associated with the right in Mexico either. It's actually somewhat mixed as far as which parties have associations with evangelical movements. Like Morena, for example, there are a few
Yeah.
examples of that, right?
Yeah. What is wonderful when you're talking to, I mean, basically any other person from the Americas, so from Brazil to Central America to Canada and the US, is the fact that I think pretty clearly the evangelicals in Mexico align with the left. Doesn't mean they're very left wing on every front. We'll talk about in a sec. But I think what's interesting is what's pushed them to that. Firstly, evangelicalism isn't necessarily aligned with one ideology or another. I always point, like, especially to American like listeners, to Ronald Reagan as the moment when evangelicals in the US become militantly right wing. Because before, a lot of like evangelicals were very actively anti political.
Hmm.
And what's interesting about Mexico is it's the opposite. Because, as we've discussed, traditional far right ideology is very linked to the Catholic Church. What you get is an anti Protestantism within that strain of right wingness, which pushes evangelicals traditionally towards the left. And so, even from the 19th century, the people who were riding with Benito Juarez against the conservatives, Catholic Church and all that, was was the evangelical church. And lots of the main liberal leaders of the 19th century were evangelicals. And you can sort of push that all the way through the 20th century until the arrival of López Obrador, who institutionalizes that left-wing evangelical alliance by, yes, allowing a lot of evangelicals into Morena, but also allowing satellite parties that are explicitly evangelical. Or,
Hmm.
I mean, it's a weird sort of open secret explicit, because you're technically not allowed to have religiously affiliated parties. There can't be a Catholic party, for example. But you can have a party called, the Social Gathering Party, which only has evangelicals and their leadership is evangelical leadership. And so you can have that. And that's more or less, they were a satellite party that revolved around the Morena party, and they were their close allies. But, of course, that opens the question, right? Well, are they pro-abortion? The answer is no. But the question is Morena anti-abortion? And this opens up a different question, the opposite question, the other side of the coin from what we were talking about when it came to the PAN. If the PAN is unable to define what sort of right wing it is, what sort of left wing is Morena? And they've been very clear about, and I think that's the great triumph of Morena, which is they've created, or not created per se, but they've adopted and really taken hold of this concept of the left from that goes against what especially like American left wingers feel it should be the left, which is very socially conservative and very politically and economically left wing. In the book, I actually say like this is actually a natural conclusion that I think most left wing parties, or actually most parties that are like emerging and resisting the old liberal order have discovered, which is after the Cold War, anything that was associated with Marxism was rejected, even if you were on the left. And so, sure, economically, neoliberalism was considered to be right-wing, but also the Democrats and the sort of social movements of the 90s and early 2000s and 2010s, and the Democratic Party today, were very much aligned to the sort of new liberalism of social identity as the main marker of being left-wing. And social class, which tended to be the core of Marxist theory, was completely chucked out the window. I argue this not too explicitly in the book because it's not exactly what I'm talking about. It's not what the book's about, but it's a crucial thing to realize, which is a lot of the problems that the Democratic Party is faced with right now are pretty much the exact problems that the PAN is facing
Yes.
right now in Mexico, which is the fact that they cannot, their coalition from the previous sort of political era, that liberal era, has collapsed because there's no more interest in focusing on identity as the main drive of politics. And they still very much resist taking on social class as their new left-wing
Yes.
flag. The exceptions that prove
And
the
they're
rule, of
allowing the
course.
right to define them. They're allowing Trump to
Exactly.
define them, you know.
Exactly. And now the working class votes for the Republicans, which is unheard of in recent times. And so what you get in Mexico is the opposite, which is the left very much recaptures this, we'll call it the class-based analysis of
Hmm.
left-wingness. And that's
Hmm.
the main transition that we see in the left as López Obrador takes over Morena. A lot of people like to analyze it on the front, on the fact that, on the basis that he's a one-man party, and that he's basically a dictator within his party. I don't think that's a sophisticated analysis. Very clearly what happened is he was a leader and very powerful within his previous coalition, but that previous coalition was very much that sort of touchy-feely progressive identity politics with a bit of,
Hmm.
like redistribution in it. But they were very happy to ally and have, we'll call them neoliberal reforms with the PAN and the PRI until the very end. Whereas Morena very much rejects that, but they're very happy, going back to the evangelicals, to reject, at least at the local level, to reject abortion, to reject same-sex marriage. And we've seen that over and over again in states like the one you live in. You'll get opposition right-wingers voting with the government against same-sex marriage legislation.
So, backing up a little bit to these newer right wing movements, there's another figure in this who's gotten a lot of attention recently, and that's Ricardo Salinas Pliego, who is quite a different character from Verástegui. So, give a little bit of an idea of what he represents in the new right landscape today in Mexico.
Well, this has been a perfectly structured conversation because it leads on exactly from what we've just been talking about. If Morena identified that the main issue in Mexico was actually a class-based one, which was massive inequality, low growth, and the little growth that there was went only to the rich, etc., then Ricardo Salinas Pliego is the reaction to that successful reaction. So instead of focusing on cultural issues like religion and same-sex marriage and abortion, I think, is actually more or less for a lot of those things. He considers himself to be a liberal and a libertarian. And a
Hmm.
lot of the ideologues behind him, one of them whom I interview in the book, name escapes right now. No, I've lost it. But anyway, it'll come to me. Uh, a lot of them consider themselves to be classical liberals, so they're very much for sort of legalization of drugs, same-sex marriage, etc. But what they're for, most of all, and centrally, crucially, is free enterprise and power to, like, economic power to companies and the people, basically. And what you can imagine happening is people don't really care about, like, whether or not there's, unless it's very much politicized, which they've failed to do. Abortion and same-sex marriage don't seem to be of interest to the Mexican public. But making ends meet and how you can get hired and how you can build a company definitely is. And so what's interesting about Salinas Pliego is, as Morena succeeds or fails on the basis of their promise, this class-based analysis of Mexico's problems, if they fail, the answer will be clear retrospectively that Salinas Pliego's recipe was what Mexico actually needed, which is this sort of free-flowing enterprise, this, like, letting loose of the animal spirits, and that's actually how you make Mexico richer. And so I think that's the new conversation. That's why Ricardo Salinas Pliego, to me, is a far more interesting character in the Mexican right, who, again, right, previously probably would have said, oh, I'm a liberal, but is now actively saying I'm right-wing. And
Hmm.
so you've got this new creation of a man who, whenever he talks about corruption, whenever he talks about violence and cartels, he's actually always going back to this free enterprise libertarian vision of how the government should run. Now, I'm terrified of that. I'm usually sort of more sophisticated and nuanced about the different options provided by political parties as an analyst. But I think he has a very clear track record, because if he governs the country, or whoever he elects governs the country like he'd like it to be governed, we're in for a world of hurt because of how we've seen him run his companies. Ricardo Salinas Pliego is a media, banking, and retail mogul. And during the pandemic, because he was very much for freedom of enterprise and no government intervention, what that ended up meaning was he forced his people to go in without face masks into work every single day as the pandemic raged. Now, I don't know, I'd be interested to see what the death toll is for his companies for that time, but just the image of him having a massive Christmas party right in the middle of what should have been a lockdown is pretty horrifying, especially given that at the same time, I think Boris Johnson was being sacked as Prime Minister of the UK for having had a little like drinks gathering at his house. So I think that tells you a lot about the sort of man that Secretary Carlos Salinas Pliego is, which is a man who is obsessed with his vision of running a company and thinking, actually, if I were allowed to do everything I want to do with my companies, Mexico would be a better place. And I think that's a dangerous sort of political extremism to exist in.
Yes. Well, and how do you think he can counteract the idea that, I mean, if he wants the state to be less involved in everything, and the state, in a sense, is the enemy, right? How does he counteract the argument that Mexico's already tried all of this deregulation and a much reduced role for the state, and it did not work out well? So what do you think he would bring to that would be different?
Say what I mentioned, probably say what I mentioned in the book, which is you can arrive to power with a very clear ideological agenda, but once you're in power, you have to become a pragmatist, right? And so even people who were closest to his ideology, like Vicente Fox in the year 2000, in the sort of midst of liberal like optimism, even Vicente Fox was unable to pass all the liberalizing reform he would have wanted to, because he had Congress and just the Mexican state to contend with. And so what Ricardo Salinas Pliego would probably say is, actually, even under the people who said they were going to be liberalized, even the people who said they were going to run the government like a company, they failed because there was too much government. So really, it's a bit like, the classic sort of Stalinist communists saying,
I was about to say,
we've never
never
seen
really
true
been tried.
communism. Well, libertarians are the new communists. They always say we've never had true libertarianism. And so, yeah, I think that's the answer.
That's utopian.
Yeah, it is.
So what are the ingredients that the right would need, do you think, to start actually winning elections here? And also at the same time, as you've hinted at, why is the party system as it is today working against them?
It's a very tough ask, because what I found throughout like the writing of the book and this sort of period of Mexican right-wingness is that every movement and every party has something the other desperately needs, and they lack everything else. And so if you could have a Frankenstein monster of like every single right-wing party and movement, you might have a chance, but you haven't. So some of them have charismatic leaders, but they don't have party machineries. And the people who have party machineries don't have charismatic leaders. And the people who have charismatic leaders also don't have like the party they need to win the elections. And so what you'd need is, I think, basically an agreement between at least two of these right-wing forces. The clearest one to me, and the one that I think would be most likely to succeed, would be Salinas Pliego joining up with the PAN. And there's sort of been a bit of flirtation going on there. Why is that? Because the PAN lacks like programmatic and ideological clarity and leadership. And that's exactly what Salinas Pliego has. But the problem with Salinas Pliego is, even though he's a mogul, even though he's a billionaire, he can't use any of that money legally to run for office. That's illegal in Mexico. And that's what you're mentioning. The fact that the Mexican political system, designed at the end, that one-party state system, is an incumbent reproducing machine. You can't become a party without really having already been a party. It's like when you're a teenager or like a graduate just coming out of the university, and you need a job, but to get a job, you need a job experience. And so you end up in this terrible negative feedback loop. It's very difficult to create a new political party. We're literally at this moment ending the tiny window every 6 years that you're allowed to have to create a new party. So San Luis has lost his window, and he'd have to wait another 6 years, basically, to even consider it, which he could do. But probably more conveniently to him, he could take control of the apparatus of the existing PAN and become its leader, which, by the way, isn't outlandish because that's exactly how Morena started. Morena, even with López Obrador as sort of like a generational political talent, probably the most important and powerful politician of the 21st century in Mexico, or definitely, sorry,
Hmm.
even he struggled. It took him 10 years, and he had to use a pre-existing party as a sort of institutional springboard to create that other new party.
Hmm.
And then even before that, you had the businessmen, and they were all men, really, of the 1980s who took over the PAN and took them to victory in the year 2000.
Yeah,
So
Fox.
it's a tried and tested formula, which I think the PAN is actually kind of open to as well. So I think that's the clearest route to victory for the
Hmm.
right.
And where does that leave Verástegui and what he represents as far as that current of the new right? Do you think they would just kind of get swept along with them?
Verástegui and the people who are closest to him, I think, would probably just eventually join whatever right-wing movement that gave them their space. I see Verástegui as a bit of like the Maha movement in the US. Like there's a ideologically distinctive but clearly aligned tranche of the MAGA movement that is led by RFK, even though RFK is not necessarily very MAGA beyond a few
Right,
very
right,
specific points of like
right.
contention, which is and the clearest point of contention being the government, the deep state is out to get you. And so I think that's enough for them to get together. And again, right, I think the socialists are out to get you is the right wing call to arms, even though it's clearly not the case. Arguably, you can say Morena is quite right wing in many of its approaches and quite neoliberal in its economic vision. And there's
Mhm,
only a few very clearly new left wing positions that it has, including like the sort of like the redistribution. But it's handier propaganda
PAN
if you can
says
call
they'll
them
continue,
socialists.
right? I mean, the PAN has also gotten on board with the
Yes,
idea of these
exactly.
programs.
Because they're
Yeah,
popular, right? That's why
right.
Morena keeps winning. All this socialism's great if it wins elections, and that's why we have weekends and all that. But funnily enough, what we have, the fear that these right wingers have of the socialist boogeyman probably is enough to bring them together.
Mhm.
And even if it's imaginary.
Right. I mean, but then if you translate that into the voting population, it's a lot harder because it, really because Morena has taken up all of this space in Mexican politics where yes, they're a leftist party, but as you say, they're not an extremely, progressive identitarian movement. And Scheinbaum has been tougher on crime than AMLO, definitely, so far. And things seem to be improving on that front. And so it leaves them with a limited space to operate. But what do you think would be the issue that could make Morena susceptible to an attack from the right?
Time is the opposition's greatest ally. I mean, incredibly popular parties can collapse in popularity
Mhm.
whenever crisis comes around or knocking. But also, the point of democracy is that it allows you to just get rid of like stagnant political parties. Morena already detects this within itself, which is
Mhm.
as they continue their hold on power, and as it becomes apparent to lots of people that it's the only way to quickly exercise political power in the immediate term, they're being, I wouldn't even call it infiltrated because they're quite open. They're just joining up and bringing their political machineries along to help out with the, like electorally in their own regions and then get, the Morena badge and get elected. Guess what? That's exactly what happened to the PAN in the year 2000, which is what led to the collapse of the PAN and its corruption and its sort of like ideological loss. And that's more or less what happened to the PRI as well. And so what you can see happening is very much the same trend, which is Morena losing itself,
Mhm.
becoming a patronage machine rather than a political electoral machine. And that becomes very problematic because it will stop responding to the electorate.
Mhm.
And that means that it'll open up spaces for other people and other parties and other movements to grab those votes. What I categorically reject is, even though I argue throughout the book, it's really important for parties to have clear ideological, programmatic visions because that clarifies what they are to people. At the same time, people aren't actually that ideological. People, even
Right.
though people, but the problem is people need clarity to see whether or not you are trustworthy. And I think if you're flip flopping, if you're sort of looking a bit dodgy about what you believe in rather than having clarity, I think that's what puts people off because you stink of inauthenticity, which in the age of social media is essential. And that's why you get people like Trump or Milei or Bukele coming to power, because there's a lot of people who are very willing to hold their nose, but very happy to vote for you because they say, I hate the government as it exists, and I know what you stand for.
Right. Right. So to wrap up with a little bit of political forecasting, which you've already touched on a bit, but do you think that there's a chance there will be some wins for the right in 2027 in those the midterm elections first, and then we'll get to 2030?
I don't know. So, for example, this is what's interesting to me. Morena, in becoming a political patronage machine, also becomes inherently corrupt in lots of places. And so we get these horrible stories like the one we recently heard in Jalisco about a cartel member basically torturing other, or literally torturing other Morena members, so within their own party, to take control of a town as an elected, like first as the candidate and then as the elected leader. So he got elected legitimately, but what was illegitimate was the fact that the way he took that candidacy from his colleagues. That worries me because I think there's lots of places that are ripe for the plucking for the opposition from Morena. Places like Sinaloa, where there is active, like, anger at the president and the governor and the Morena party for having failed to quell the violence there. The problem is if whether or not the opposition can organize effectively. And that's not only their own ineptitude, that is also the ability to organize in the face of what is clearly, I think at this point, a government that, even if we don't say that it's aligned with the cartels, it's a government that is allowed to exist with the cartels. And like what's worrying to the governor at the moment, and he said this explicitly, is the civil war throws up a lot of turbulence and forces him to, it makes it less clear, and therefore he fears for his life. Whereas before, when there was one cartel in charge, he seemed quite happy. You get that reproduced across a lot of Mexico. So that's the dodgy part about any prediction anyone makes. The parts of Mexico that would be ripe for Morena to lose are also exactly the sorts of places where it'd be difficult for the opposition to organize effectively for various reasons.
Mm,
I mean,
mhm.
maybe the most interesting one is always the places where the opposition is already strong, like your home state of Guanajuato. But, of course, because they're already strong, it also allows Morena to accuse them of having been inept as well. And so you can blame the PAN governor, or in Chihuahua as well, right? Or in Nuevo León, where
Yes.
you've got MC, and it looks likely that Morena will actually win in Nuevo León next time they have an election. Mexico City, I think, is an interesting place. Again, right, like their own worst enemy, because the PAN should be able to do well here,
Hmm.
because Morena's been, and the heirs of Morena have been in power for so long here that,
So
funnily
long.
enough, the reaction to Morena, even though Mexico City is considered to be a left-wing place,
Hmm.
is probably the most sort of prepared here. But what have we got? We've got the probably most corrupt version of the PAN in power in Mexico City. And so it makes it a very difficult choice, even if you do dislike Morena.
Hmm. Hmm.
So yeah, basically that's me not answering your question.
Very, very skillfully. And so in 2030, do you think, well, we could have potentially Salinas Pliego, maybe running for
Maybe.
president,
Yeah.
versus maybe Garcia Harfuch, maybe.
Maybe. Yeah, exactly. The right versus the right, basically.
Uh-huh, yes. So I mean, I guess, do you see enough seriousness, and I know it's very hard to say at this point, but in someone like Salinas Pliego that is an option, or do you think that he will back away from, I mean, in a way, why would he get into politics so much um, with what he already has? But
There is an interesting thing throughout the writing of the book, and for 15 years before that, which was the ongoing case against Salinas Pliego to charge him the taxes he owes the government through his companies. Billions of dollars, billions and billions of dollars. And he seems to have come to an agreement with the government because what he's paying, or what the government says he's paying, seems to be way less than what he owes.
Mhm.
Then again, it's an ongoing process, so maybe it'll be trickle down economics for him.
Yeah.
for the judges trickling down orders to
Hmm.
pay more and more money. The problem is, I think that's a very big incentive for him to get into politics, because that's really what he wants. I mean, a lot of the people that he works with and who have worked with him closely, who talked to me for the book, insisted that he wasn't actually that interested in like being in electoral politics, because it's a it's
It's a
it's
dirty
it's
business.
handcuffs as well. You've got loads of
Yeah.
legalistic stuff that you've got to comply with. Whereas if you're a billionaire, you can just influence politics from the outside far more effectively, and you can have fun as well. You don't have to go to rallies, because you can head to the hacienda or your beach club and have fun there. Right. The problem is, it almost feels like the tax thing is what's pushed him into politics,
Hmm.
and so depending on whether or not it is resolved, I think that'll push him or pull him away from it. But he's clearly still very angry about it. One of the things that I thought might happen is, if he was charged the money, he might pull away from politics a bit. But it doesn't seem like it. He's very much involved, and he's got a new slogan which I think is interesting. I wonder how far it'll go, which is MAC, which is the Movement Against Corruption, the Movimiento Anticorrupción Ciudadano. I think it's something like that. It's MACC, and that's his new sort of like byword. And so I'd be interested to see if that turns into anything. But for the
Hmm.
moment, the right is very much in disarray, and the government is relatively stable. But that leaves Mexicans in a weird situation, because the government isn't doing amazingly either. Violence is going down in some places. Overall, I think they're doing quite well in that, but it's still a very violent country. The economy has completely stalled, and I think that's a massive problem for the president. And I think she understands it, and I think she's doing a lot of things that I think are great moves. But of course, she's got this like Damocles sword hanging over her, which is she's pushing for austerity because her predecessor indebted the country and basically left that turd on her desk. And she's also got to attract investment as her party continues to insist on scaring off investors.
Hmm.
So I think she's quite good at balancing that weird and horrible like thing of like
And then
but
she's got the trade agreement to deal with.
which I think, to be honest, is the most delicate one, but actually the easiest one, because I think Americans, it's very much a lobbying effort for with Americans, and I think Mexico's quite good at that. And also, the Americans are realizing that they need it, because Donald Trump, as we know, can't afford the U.S. economy to crash. And if he screws around with the USMCA, the US economy will crash. I mean, you can see it very clearly, actually, in the US stats. I know this is a Mexico podcast, but this is a very relevant stat, which is, you look at how and why the US economy has grown recently, which it has grown quite forcefully. And what you actually see is, it's actually non-job creating investment that has kept the economy
Mm.
afloat, which is mostly AI stuff. But if you look at manufacturing, it is completely stalled as well, alongside the Mexican economy, which is non-AI and very, very manufacturing based. And so actually, you can see how tethered those two parts of the US and Mexican economy are. And I mean, to be honest, it's not the worst problem to have if investment has stalled, because it means investment is still trickling in. Whereas if people actively pull out of their investments in the US and Mexico because the USMCA is no longer viable, that's when you'll see a crash in the US economy.
Which reminds me of the first interview that I did with you in November 2024, which I'll link to in the show notes, because it was all
Yes.
about Trump and the Mexican economy. And I think it's held up quite well. So thank you so much for taking the time today to talk about this. And I will link to your book and to your excellent publication here on Substack. And
Thank you.
we will talk again soon.
Lovely being here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.